So as I said, plenty to talk about. And joining me now is Assistant Science, Tech and Digital Economy Minister and Cabinet Secretary, Andrew Charlton. Andrew Charlton, thanks so much for your time. Let me ask about this climate target. I don't want you to give me the scoop here live on air, although it'd be nice. But what I've speculated on then is you might not land in this 65 to 75% figure that people are talking about. And that would kind of make sense in terms of what the PM's saying, that you've got to come to a target for 2035 that the government can reach. And we've seen other developed economies scale back their ambitions as well slightly, haven't they?
Well, Andrew, the target needs to be, as the Minister has said, ambitious and achievable. There is a process here that is enshrined in the Climate Change Act, which is that the Climate Change Authority has to get advice on the science, and we've seen some of that advice come out in the last 24 hours. And the Minister has to take that advice into account in determining the target. So we are going through that process in a methodical way to get to the right outcome for Australia's target for 2035.
And will that be Thursday? Will we have a cabinet meeting ahead of that? And will we have a caucus meeting ahead of that? Because in opposition, when the 43% by 2030 target was, Anthony Albanese came up with that went through the full caucus.
Well, look, the Climate Change Minister has been extremely consultative right throughout this process. He's been working with colleagues in Cabinet and in caucus. He's going to take this through to make the decision in the right way that fully incorporates the views of his caucus and also discharges his responsibility to take into account advice from the Climate Change Authority, which is ultimately based on the science, which we released today in full. And people can read that report and its technical appendices that's run to many, many hundreds of pages to get their view on that report and what it means for our climate change challenge.
Will the target be legislated like the 2030 target?
I'm not sure the answer to that question. This is a target which will be a decision of Cabinet, and that will go through in the next week in accordance with the procedures. I don't know the answer to whether or not it'll be legislated.
All right, well, let's talk about this report you were talking about, these dire climate warnings that have been issued by Chris Bowen's department. Now, your electorate has the Parramatta River in it. Do you think a whole bunch of people should be moving their businesses from near the river based on these sort of doomsday warnings, Andrew Charlton?
Well, look, I wouldn't call them doomsday warnings. You know, this is a serious piece of scientific work. It's done independently of government. It's done by the Bureau of Meteorology, it's done by the CSIRO, by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, by Geosciences Australia. All of these very professional organisations put their best information and research into this report, which lays out their view on the risks associated with climate change. Those risks include impacts on public health, impacts on natural disasters, impacts on our coastal regions. I think the report lays them out in great detail for everybody to form their own view of. All right, I don't think it's an alarmist report.
What about locally, though? Can you see issues with flooding locally?
Well, we have a lot of issues in Western Sydney to do with climate change. You know, we have more and more days of extreme heat in Western Sydney. We have more and more challenges with flooding across Western Sydney that occurs on a regular basis, including in the Parramatta River. Not every single one of these should be attributed to climate change, but the evidence is that climate change does make natural disasters more frequent, and that's something that we should be taking into account when we think about the costs and benefits of action on climate change. So in answer to your question, absolutely. Western Sydney has a lot to gain from action on climate change, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation.
So it feels in a way you're giving, it's the old political thing, Andrew Charlton. You give us the problem and then you give us the solution. And I'll put that in inverted commas because Australia can raise its target to 65% or like I say, 61, 63 or whatever. it doesn't stop climate change, does it? If China and India and the US are still doing it, of course, we export a lot of coal to China and India, etc. So is it a bit... It's not really going to solve the problem, whatever target you come up with, is it?
Well, what's important is that we do two things. First of all, we do our bit to solve the problem, and there are many countries around the world that are acting. You know, climate change in some countries is moving forward with lots of action. In other countries, it takes 2 steps forwards and 1 step back. From Australia's perspective, we know a couple of things. We know that climate change is not going away. It is a problem that the world will have to address, and it's a problem that Australia will have to address. We know that the costs of inaction are higher than the costs of action. And we know that the best way to prosecute that action is to do it in a methodical, step-by-step way. Not to veer one way or veer the other way, come up with a whole range of different proposals from, like the Liberals have, from nuclear to pretending that it's not happening, to abandoning net zero, to jumping on a different scheme. You know, the best way to deal with this challenge is to recognise that it's happening and to methodically go about the process.
But aren't you veering both?
That is both the lowest...
Andrew Charlton, aren't you veering both ways? Because it seems a bit hypocritical to, on one hand, talk about this, we need to meet this target, Australia's doing its bit, but on the other say, oh, look, we've approved the North West Shelf and our fossil fuel exports are worth tens of billions a year, and that's the story in this you don't seem to want to talk about as a government, not you personally. And yet that's very real. The economy's screwed without that. So that's contributing to what you say is the problem. While at the same time you say, well, here's this domestic target. We're trying to get together to fix the problem.
I'm very happy to talk about this. I mean, the North West Shelf is a very large project. It's been a complex and complicated decision. You know, gas is a really important transition fuel. You know, gas supports the firming of renewables. It is a source of electricity that you can turn on and off, unlike coal. Gas is an important part of the transition to a low-carbon future. You know, I think about Australia as a supporter of the global effort to tackle climate change, and that includes the role that we have in exporting transition fuels like gas, and includes the role that we have in being a renewable energy superpower with huge potential for solar and wind and other forms of renewable energy. So I think Australia's role in the global climate change transition is one that we should be positive about and one that we should recognise affords lots of opportunities for this country.
Do you think this climate risk assessment gives insurance companies an excuse to raise their premiums even more than they already have? Will it give them that excuse?
I don't think it's about giving insurance companies an excuse, Andrew. We're already seeing many insurance companies have extremely high premiums and many people unable to afford a few different types of insurance, including flood insurance. The problem there is not insurance companies. The problem there is not reports from scientific bodies. The problem there is that climate change is making flooding more frequent and more severe.
You don't believe there's any price,
problem, and that's
you don't
what we
believe
have to
there's
address.
any price gouging by the insurance companies as far as you're concerned? Everything's hunky-dory on that front.
I'm not saying that there's no price gouging by insurance companies. What I'm saying is the fundamental problem here that is making insurance unaffordable is the increased natural disasters that we are seeing in this country that are causing premiums to go up and the costs of addressing natural disasters skyrocket. That's the fundamental problem. That is what this risk assessment points to, and that is what the government's action on climate change is seeking to address.
Polling consistently shows people want action on climate change, but that's until you tell them it costs them more. When the government releases this target, will the government release information alongside that which will say what will happen to people's power bills?
Well, the government is doing modelling on different climate scenarios. I should point out that this is modelling that is being done in Treasury, and Jim Chalmers has brought back this modelling. This is a capability within Treasury that Tony Abbott axed, and the coalition did not do any economic analysis of climate change during their period in office, which I think is a
how much power bills will go up
huge
by?
abdication.
Do you accept?
I think that is a huge abdication of responsibility. So it's really positive that Jim Chalmers has taken the initiative to bring back that capability in Treasury to do modelling of the costs and benefits of taking action on climate change. And that modelling will inform the government's choices going forward. And I'm sure that some of that modelling will be released to the public. Exactly what it contains or what it doesn't contain, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know the exact ins and outs of what will be in that modelling, but I'll tell you what, it's the first modelling that's going to be done in more than 10 years because the Liberals abandoned that capability within Treasury because they didn't even want to get the data to make a decision that showed them how important this was. So they just axed the capability within Treasury. A terrible abdication of responsibility that tells you, everything you need to know about how serious the Liberal Party is about climate change.
We've had this bill spike, if you like. You've had the rebates on. They've been cut and they'll be totally phased out soon. Do you acknowledge any of the increase in people's power bills is because of the rollout of renewable energy and the transition?
What I think I acknowledge is that renewables is the cheapest source of new power into the grid. It is much cheaper than the alternative proposal that we had at the last election, which is to spend $600 billion on nuclear power.
But that's not my question with respect. That is not my question with respect. My question is, do you acknowledge that the transition to renewables, rolling this out, we've got transmission lines and all these other costs, has contributed to an increase in power bill costs?
What I can tell you, Andrew, and let me be very clear about this, is that we have advice that the lowest cost way to deal with climate change and manage the energy transition is to increase the share of renewables in the grid. So what I can say to you in relation to people's power bills is that those power bills would be higher under the alternative scenario. Higher under nuclear, higher under not having renewables in the grid. To answer your question very clearly, people's power bills are going to be lower than they would otherwise be because renewables are the cheapest form of new power into the grid.
Well, we'll see about that, I guess. What about your own circumstance? Do you have solar panels on your homes? Do you have an electric vehicle? Do you have batteries?
I do not have an electric vehicle, but I know a lot of people are taking up electric vehicles, and I think that's a choice for many Australians. I think we've seen a big increase in the uptake of renewable of electric vehicles. We've seen a huge uptake in the government's new battery program. I think 55,000 Australians have taken up home batteries. And this is a terrific thing. This is an opportunity for Australians to take charge of their own energy.
Do you have solar panels and batteries yourself?
I don't have solar panels or batteries, but plenty of Australians do, and that's a good thing.
So you don't have any solar panels or batteries? Sorry, just cut out there for a sec.
No, I don't have any solar panels or batteries.
As such a strong supporter of this move towards addressing climate change, perhaps should you?
Well, I'll take your advice, Andrew. I would think about it, but I think it's terrific that lots of Australians do. They have different circumstances make it appropriate for some people to have them and other people not to have them. It depends a bit on the tenure of your housing situation. It depends a little bit on your preferences about how you use your vehicle, about how you use your home. I think for different Australians, different solutions will work for them. And I think it's a choice that all Australians have. From the government's perspective, our role is to support those choices, and we've done that by providing support for solar panels on people's roofs, to provide support for people who want to have electric vehicles, to provide support for people who want to have home batteries.
Sure.
We're not forcing anybody to do that, but we're making it available as a choice for those people.
All right, not much time left, sorry. Now, we had a further announcement today in relation to the social media ban. Do you think this ban will work? Should people have any concerns about the prospect of their face being used to open a social media account, which is what Julian and Grant seem to be suggesting?
Look, this is a world first. This is a really positive piece of legislation that Australia is doing to protect our kids, to give parents the peace of mind to know that their young children will not be exposed on these platforms to harmful forms of content. Now, the way that that's been implemented, we've had some new details about that today. There are, of course, challenges in doing something which is a world first, which is world leading. But I think we've seen clear guidance from the E-Safety Commissioner about how that will be implemented. You know, do I think it's infallible? I think the Minister herself has said absolutely not. But what we're doing here is a world first. It is going to make a big difference. It's going to be a big support to parents. It will stop thousands and thousands of kids being affected by harmful content. Will there be, different situations where people slip through the net or are able to avoid it? Possibly. But what we're doing is a lot better than doing nothing. And I think it's going to make a big difference to parents and kids right across Australia.
All right. Skynews.com.au, my colleague Oscar Godsall's reported this afternoon that in June, TikTok and its lobbyists, someone we're both familiar with, Sabina Husick, she's been a Labor personality for a while, that they met with Annika Wells in June saying, we don't want YouTube exempt from this ban. And in July, the Prime Minister and Annika Wells announced that YouTube wouldn't be exempt from this ban. So was the government influenced by TikTok on this occasion? What was the reason for inserting YouTube in there?
Well, I haven't seen that report, but Minister Wells has been very clear on the reason for including YouTube in there. It's because a large amount of the harmful content that Australian children are exposed to comes through that particular channel. And so, for that reason, it would be unconscionable for the Minister not to include that channel in this social media ban. That's the whole point of this social media ban, is to protect children from that content, and they need to see where it is.
You don't think it was off TikTok's urging?
I think the Minister has been very clear about the evidence that she looked at when she was making that decision, and that evidence is very clear. And in the face of that evidence, I don't think you would expect the Minister to make any other decision.
Andrew Charlton, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.